Armies aren't that much different from individual people. As soon as they buy one gun, they immediately want a different gun. Thanks for tuning in to another video on ForgottenWeapons.com. I'm Ian McCollum. I'm here today at the James Julia Auction House taking a look at some of the guns they are going to be selling in their upcoming spring of 2017 auction this April. And today I'm looking at two examples of a very rare 22 caliber military conversion of the 1911 pistol. This came about in, well, 1913, basically just after the US had formally adopted the 45 caliber 1911 as its new service sidearm. It was then decided that, well, you needed a 22 caliber version of the pistol as well for less expensive training. Get guys at indoor ranges, you could use cheap ammo, less recoil, better for training troops. A lot of different reasons you'd want a 22 caliber version of your pistol. Frankly, they're the same reasons that individual people want 22 caliber sub-caliber conversions of, say, larger pistols. So the first gun to fill this requirement was what was called the first type Springfield Gallery Practice Pistol. And it was a conversion that actually used basically dummy 45 caliber cartridges, which were hollowed out in the center and would hold a 22 caliber actual cartridge. The idea being you'd have a 45 caliber chamber, and then your bolt face was the same, and your magazines could be the same, and you just feed this dummy 45 that held a 22, and then you'd fire the 22. That's an okay idea. That was used in some other 22 caliber conversions of other guns, but the big problem it had with the 1911 in this particular iteration was that it didn't function in semi-auto. You had to manually operate the slide to chamber each round, and that wasn't what the Army was looking for. And it had a lot of parts breakage issues, and it didn't shoot very accurately. So that conversion was really a non-starter. Well, then, in January of 1914, a guy named J.H. Carl from Gilroy, California, submitted a design of his own for a 22 caliber conversion of the 1911 to the military. Basically mailed them up and said, hey, I've got this idea for a 22 pistol, and here's some drawings, and here's my idea. And they took a look at it and went, wow, that actually looks a lot better. Can you send us a complete gun to test? And so a couple months later, April of 1915, he sent them a complete gun, and they did some testing with that, and they went, you know, this actually really looks quite good. And that is basically what we have here today, are two of those. Now, Springfield went through this pistol, and they came to the conclusion that there wasn't actually any novel patented element in it from Carl, that they were thinking that they could actually manufacture this pistol and not have to pay any royalties, which is a little unfortunate, certainly, for J.H. Carl, but it would never actually get to that point. So they originally ordered 20 of the pistols to be made for trialing, and then reduced that actually to 5 pistols. Those were manufactured by the end of 1915, and they went in to do some testing. These trials pistols worked reasonably well. They were quite accurate. One of the other big advantages they had is they were able to manufacture them to be virtually the exact same weight and balance as a 1911. And that's why you'll see this weird scalloping profile to the slides. It's because they wanted it to balance the same as a standard 45, where the 45, of course, at the front has this big, hollow, open 45 caliber barrel. The 22 has a very small barrel, so it's got a lot more metal up front. So cut big scallops in the slide to reduce the amount of weight at the front. The magazines were a bit of an issue. Carl had his original magazine was a 5-shot Stevens 22 caliber rifle magazine that he had fitted into a 1911 body, and it didn't work all that well. It's interesting that when Carl submitted this proposal to the Army, he actually mentioned in the letter specifically that he was not, as he put it, a mechanic, which is what you would have termed a machinist at the time. He wasn't a master machinist, but he thought, and he didn't propose that the gun that he sent would be suitable for a serious heavy-duty trial, but he thought that the idea had merit, and his pistol was to be an example of the idea. And if Springfield were to make them, they would be better manufactured, and they could work out all the little tweaks and make it run just right. And that's what Springfield decided to try to do. So they improved the magazine. There were a couple different versions of the magazine. And then World War I got in the way. So there had been a plan to purchase 25 more of these for testing, but as the U.S. went into World War I, Springfield looked at this and said, you know, we don't really want to take up an experimental project right now. We're busy making as many rifles as we can crank out for this thing in Europe. And so the project got sidelined. December of 1918, none other than Julian Hatcher basically picks up the phone and calls over to Springfield and goes, hey, how about those 22 pistols? Can we get back on that? We still need a 22 caliber gallery pistol for training with these 1911s. And at this point, the project kind of bogged down a bit. The 25 pistols were manufactured finally by 1919, late in 1919. And then they spent like 4 or 5 years in testing. They'd send a batch to these guys, and those guys would eventually get around to doing some shooting with them. And then they'd send them back, and they'd send them to someone else. And the gun was like 95% good, but it never quite fed and extracted and ejected all reliably. And I'm sure we've all had 22 caliber pistols that were like this. It pretty much works, but every couple of magazines you're going to have, you're going to get some sort of ejection failure or feed failure, and that kind of plagued these 22 conversions. They just couldn't quite get them right. So finally, by 1924, this testing and modification process was still going on, and someone got wind that Colt was working on making their own 22 caliber conversion for the commercial market. And at that point, I don't have any documentation on this, but I can just see some ordnance officer looking and going, Colt's going to make these. Hallelujah, we don't have to deal with this project anymore. Put that all on hold. Let's get on to doing something that I'm interested in. Now, a 1911 slide is far too heavy to be cycled by a 22 rimfire cartridge. So any conversion has to somehow take that into account. What Carl's design did here was to fix the slide in place and just have a small moving breech block inside of it. So when you fire, all that's actually moving is this little breech block, just like that. And it will recock the hammer. If I can do this on camera, there you go. Recocks the hammer like that, and these would function semi-automatically, which is something that the first version of Springfield's gallery pistol did not do. So here are the 2 different magazines for these pistols. This is a first pattern and a second pattern. These are basically just 22 caliber rifle magazines fitted into 1911 magazine bodies. So there's a curve to the magazine inside that you can't see really through the mag body. These hold 7 rounds, just as do the standard 1911 mags. Carl's original magazine held 5. One of the things Springfield deliberately wanted to do was up that to 7 to match the capacity of the 45. Now the second pattern guns added this little manual follower tab so that you can pull the follower down while you're loading. Makes it simpler to load. That's a common feature on 22 rimfire mags. So the frame assembly, the frame, the trigger, the hammer, everything below the slide is completely standard on these 22 pistols. No modifications necessary at all. And by the way, there is record out there of the serial numbers, the frame serial numbers associated with the different slides that were manufactured. So this, for example, is slide number 24 with an interesting backward stamped 4, but that's a separate issue. And then the frame number on this is 500781. Now, according to the official data, this should be, I believe, slide number 8. However, because these frames are totally standard, these things got swapped around all the time. So some of them are on different frames, some of them are on frames that were not originally part of the 22 caliber project, and that's really to be expected. Disassembly is going to begin by pushing out the slide stop pin. Once that's out, then we can pull the whole slide assembly off. There we go, nice and easy. Now this is the ejector, which fell out because it is supposed to sit right there. There we go. So that's how the ejector actually sits in the gun. And when the bolt cycles backward, you can see right there that ejector fixed in the slide is going to hit the case and kick it out of the gun. The rest of this slide is pretty simple and straightforward. It's one large milled piece. There is not a separate barrel. The barrel is this center hole right here. The top is the recoil spring guide, and the bottom is simply hollow to remove weight. This lug drops down and interfaces with the slide stop pin just to hold the whole thing in place. And to take the bolt out, we have to unscrew the recoil spring guide. All right, that is going to come out right there. So spring, the guide, The back end of the guide is threaded, and it screws into the bolt itself. Now, to get this bolt out, what you do is actually pull it all the way to the back, and then you can rotate it 90 degrees down because there's a cutout in the bottom of the slide. And then we're going to pull it forward to right here. Rotate it to the side and pull it out. You can see the threaded bits right back here. This recoil spring guide runs in there and then screws into the bolt, just like that. Have a firing pin at the top there, which connects right back here, and this is hit by the standard 1911 hammer. It is spring-loaded. And there you can see that working. Extractor, groove right here for the ejector, all of the standard components of a pistol. Looking at the body, the top hole there is for the recoil spring guide, the bottom hole is the barrel. And everything else is just a space for the bolt, plus these cutouts to allow for disassembly. It's really quite the slick design, and it's too bad that they weren't able to get it working quite right, although I suspect that a more serious development program, something like, frankly, what Colt did, because Colt had a commercial interest in making the gun work right, and they were able to dedicate the resources to getting the Service Ace conversion functioning just right. There's no reason that that couldn't have been done on this pistol. It's just that Springfield had other priorities, and just my expectation is they just didn't dedicate the resources necessary to get a potentially finicky pistol like a .22 conversion to work just right. Ultimately, for J.H. Carl, I suppose that's a disappointment, although I think there's really serious question as to whether he would have been paid for this design anyway, given Springfield's assessment that nothing in it was actually really patented and proprietary to him. It was a collection of previously patented by other people design features. And that's, of course, how most firearms work. There are very few truly new ideas, just better and worse collections of existing ideas. So there are two different batches of these pistols. There's the 25-gun batch that Springfield made and delivered after World War I, and then there's the handful of pre-production guns that were made before World War I. This is a pre-production gun. It is not serial numbered, which is correct for that. This is obviously number 24, as we've looked at. Now there are a couple different types of markings, and we actually have to look at both guns to see the complete set of markings. So these post-war guns are going to be marked .22 caliber long rifle, with the exception of the other ones in .22 short, which I expect would have been marked .22 caliber short, although I don't have one to confirm that. And then on the right side, they are marked US, Springfield Armory, and then a serial number, or potentially just a serial number. There's some variation in these. Then there's an eagle here, which is hard to see on this gun. This earlier version, however, which is in much nicer finish condition, you can see that eagle, that US crest eagle very nicely, right there in between the lightning groove and the bolt. There are potentially also going to be numbers on some of the internal parts. This one, as you can see, has bolt number 2, although the main body of the slide is unnumbered. Now, going back to this one for a moment, you can see the eagle there now, right here, but notice that the eagle's one wing has been ground away and cut away. What's interesting is this shows evidence of Springfield's ongoing experimentation in getting these guns just right, because the ejection port, the opening here, has been expanded on this pistol. Normally, that ejection port stops nice and flush on both sides with the bolt handle. On this one, it's been opened up forward. And as far as I've seen from pictures, this is the only example I've seen that has had that modification done to it. And so that's pretty cool. So in total, only about 30 of these were made, plus a couple more that were done, I didn't mention this, experimentally in .22 short instead of .22 long rifle. Those didn't go very well. Those weren't well liked, and they were even less reliable. They're really quite scarce today. In 38, they were officially scrapped by the Army. Paperwork went through that they could just get rid of them. And at that point, there were only a couple left. Presumably, over that time period, they'd been lost. Probably some had just kind of walked out the door. In fact, almost guaranteed some had walked out the door, because those are some of the ones that are still around today. and they'd probably been scavenged for parts. You know, the frames on these are just standard unmodified 1911 frames. So they get switched around, and people, you know, someone needs a frame for a regular pistol, so they pull the frame off, and then who knows what happens to the slide assembly. At any rate, there were never very many. There are many fewer now, and so if you would like to have one of these, there are not very many opportunities to do so, but this is one of them. Both of these are coming up for sale here at the Julia Auction House. If you take a look at the description text below, you'll find links to the catalog pages for both of them. They are being sold separately, not as a pair. And you can take a look at Julia's pictures and descriptions, and if you're interested in bidding on one or both, you can do that right through their website. Thanks for watching.